Thank you. Thank you, Sean, for organizing this workshop. Indigeneity is usually defined as representing a unique cultural, religious, social, and national identity tied to the specific land, especially while being detached of it. In many cases, this identity also includes shared traditions, languages, and community structures. The destruction of the first temple, Judah's exile to Babylonia, required the Judean exile to preserve their personal and collective identities while they are disconnected from their homeland in Judah. Both the book of Ezekiel and the Yahudu Tablets reflect the challenges of preserving these indigenous identities under imperial rule. In my presentation today, I will try to show that these two distinct texts reflect different and sometimes contradictory mindsets that existed among the Judean exiles in Babylonia in the first generations after the destruction. The first trend mainly expresses a desire to integrate and assimilate in the Babylonian society in which the exiles lived. In contrast, the second trend reflects efforts to preserve the cultural, national, and religious characteristics of Judean exiles, a desire to differentiate themselves from their surroundings, and a clear hope to a future return to Judah. We shall begin by examining the images emerging from the book of Ezekiel. In one of his most famous prophecies, the prophet presents his audience as feeling as if their bones have dried up and their hope has been lost. These statements reflect an utter despair. They consider the exile as the final stop of the Judeans' national journey and manifest the loss of hope to realize one of the most distinctive characteristics of indigeneity, a return to the homeland. Moreover, Ezekiel not only presents his audience as hopeless and passive, but also as actively acting to obscure their indigenous characteristics. In many prophecies, Ezekiel presents his actual audience, the Judean exiles to whom he prophesied, as idolaters, that is, as those who by their actions obscure the connection between themselves and their indigenous God. For example, the exile elders of Israel who sit before the prophet are those who have turned their thoughts upon their fetishes and set their minds upon the sin through which they have stumbled. In chapter 20, Ezekiel accuses the exiles who came to seek him of defiling themselves by going astray after their ancestors' detestable things. In the continuation of that chapter, Ezekiel attributes to his audience an explicit aspiration to forego all their indigenous characteristics and be like the nations, like the families of the lands, to worship wood and stone. Similarly, the Yahudu Tablets also record gradual assimilation processes that, by their very nature, blurred various indigenous characteristics. The well-known case of Belshazzar, son of Nuba, may serve as a good example to the way even the exiles' very names played a significant role in shaping and reshaping their identity. Although this individual's name seems Babylonian, there is clear evidence for his Judean origin, since in one of the tablets mentioning him, he is named Yahudu. This Judean adopted or was given a Babylonian name, expressing loyalty to the ruler and indicative of people who work or seek a career in the royal administration. Indeed, when Belshazzar had to change his name, he returned to his indigenous heritage. But this return was only partial. Belshazzar did not return to his original Judean name, such as Rapayama, Niryama, etc. He rather preferred to maintain the Akkadian name formula, which called a deity to protect the king, and was satisfied with replacing the Neo-Babylonian chief god with the Israelite indigenous deity. Other examples may refer to another aspect of indigeneity, the extent to which the Judean exiles in Babylonia continued to observe the Pentateuchal legal traditions. A recent study published by Yigal Bloch maintained that Judeans in Babylonia made no recognizable effort to abstain from concluding deals on Sabbath. Similarly, one of the conclusions emerging from a project I'm currently working on is that the Yahudu Tablets reveal the phenomenon of usury among fellow Judeans, starting at the beginning of the exilic period and continuing through the Persian period. It should be noted that the nature of the transaction I examined is not necessarily administrative, in the sense that the parties are not completely free economic agents, and the empire dictates the terms of their transactions and the charging of interest. The deals do not mention terms such as makur shari, royal property, or ilku and imitu, which relate to the payment of royal taxes. And in the Al-Yahudu corpus, payments owed to the imperial administration usually did not include interest. These deals rather seem to be private, voluntary transactions in which the parties choose to charge interest even though the Pentateuchal legal traditions forbid it. Now, I'm well aware that while discussing the terms biblical law and Pentateuchal law, there's a heated debate regarding several core questions. How many law codes were there? When and where were they created and by whom? What are the textual relationships between them, if at all, and to what extent these laws were widely known and obeyed by ancient Israelites? Nevertheless, in the two legal norms I just mentioned, the observance of the Sabbath and the prohibition on usury, all the divergent Pentateuchal legal traditions surprisingly agree. The Covenant Code forbids acting as creditor toward a member of my people, and the exacting of interest from poor Israelites. The priestly writings in the Pentateuch forbid exacting interest from a kinsman and debts of both money and food. And in a similar manner, the Deuteronomic law forbids any kind of interest deduction. This negative approach towards usury in the Pentateuchal legal traditions also appears in the Psalms and in the book of Proverbs, indicating that the norms in question were not adopted only by a certain literary school or only during a specific historical period, but rather were part of a long-standing tradition which was widely accepted among ancient Israel. It is difficult to conclude whether the exile's failure to maintain the Pentateuchal norms derived from temporary economic distress and necessity, or maybe from unawareness of the relevant norms. Either way, it seems that being in exile has led to the erosion of another prominent feature of the exile's indigenous identity, obedience to the legal norms that were associated with life in the homeland. We may conclude that both the book of Ezekiel and the Yahudu Tablets indicated a trend in which indigenous Judean characteristics began to erode. A shift from indigenous names to names more common in the surrounding culture, a decreasing commitment to the exclusive worship of the indigenous deity and the observance of his laws, and ultimately a renunciation of the aspiration to return to the homeland, all expressed as a desire to assimilate into the Babylonian society at the expense of preserving indigenous cultural, religious, and national characteristics. On the other hand, it is also possible to point at an opposite trend in which, in the face of external cultural pressures, there were also internal efforts to preserve indigenous characteristics. This time we will begin the discussion by examining the Al-Yahudu Tablets. The town's very name, Al-Yahudu, Judah Town, reflects the known practice to name new minority settlements in Babylonia after their original dwelling places. And indeed, the Al-Yahudu Tablets document more than 75 Judean names, and the distribution of Judean names in comparison to non-Judean names indicates that the exiles lived in a location where they represented a significant percentage of the town's population. This onomastic evidence indicates that alongside individuals such as Belshazzar, who was mentioned earlier, many exiles retained Judean theophoric names, and that manifest their Judean indigenous identity even 5 generations after the destruction. And I will not mention more examples because Tova, I think, is going to speak on this topic. Okay? So the Al-Yahudu Tablets further indicate that the Judean exiles were not only mere neighbors, but rather acted as community whose members are connected to each other through social and economic ties. Some tablets mentioned a Judean ilku obligation paid to a Judean deku, and in some cases, payments relating to several Judean landholders were formally owed by Judean individuals who acted as collecting agents for their peers. In addition to that, numerous tablets mentioned the Judean Shushanu, a term designating groups of landholders in the land for service system who share a similar occupation or geographic origin. Now, the book of Ezekiel does not contain many details about the daily lives of the prophet and his audience, and the socio-economic condition that served as the backdrop for the prophecies. Nevertheless, it seems that the book reflects the same social picture as the one emerging from the Al-Yahudu Tablets. In Ezekiel 8, Ezekiel is in his house, and the elders of Judah sit in front of him. From this, we learn that the prophet's home was known and accessible, and that the elders would regularly visit him to hear the word of the Lord. Other attestations describe the elders of Israel who came to sit before the prophet and seek the Lord through him. It seemed that the book of Ezekiel thus relates to a communal structure of the exiles in Babylonia, a discerned community with elders and prophets who are in leadership positions. In chapter 24, Ezekiel served as a portent, mofet, to the people. The Lord informed him that he is about to take away the delight of his eyes through a plague. Yet Ezekiel is forbidden to observe the customary mourning practices in such cases. Indeed, the prophet's wife dies that very evening, and Ezekiel's strange behavior, his refusal to mourn her or accept consolation, provokes the people's question. In response, Ezekiel declares that their own delight of their eyes and desire of their souls will likewise fall by the sword, and they too will be prevented from mourning their relatives. It is most likely that in this instance, Ezekiel's personal tragedy became a prophetic sign of the fall of Jerusalem. However, even if the prophecy is not based on an actual event, the imagery it employs and the fact that Ezekiel served as a portent to the people allows us to infer certain things about the prophet's circumstances and way of life. The social picture is that of a community living together, whose members support one another in times of joy and sorrow. Ezekiel's audience consists of his local community, people who under normal circumstances of mourning would have brought him bread of comforters, that is, food of comfort. More importantly, the imagery underlying the prophecy assumes that Ezekiel's wife lived with him, that she was known to his community, and that her death could be perceived by them as a sign of things to come. Ezekiel 33 serves as one of the new prophecies in the book that offers insight into the community life of the Judean exiles in Babylonia. The exiles are depicted as living in close proximity to one another, maintaining communal life, engaging in street conversation at the entrances of their houses, and gathering to hear the prophet's words. From a theological perspective, Ezekiel 36 is one of the most fundamental prophecies in the book. It conveys that Israel's conduct had defiled the land. Therefore, God has judged them as they deserve and scattered them among the nations. However, when the exiles reached Babylonia, the nations were able to identify them and to say of them, "These are the people of Yahweh, and they have left his land." The nations deduced from Israel's presence in exile that God did not want, or worse, was unable to protect them and keep them in his land, and this caused God's holy name to be desecrated. Indeed, according to Ezekiel, Israel's poor condition may lead to the desecration of God's name, and God's utter unwillingness to face this result has guided his action through history. This is, for example, the guiding principle of Ezekiel 20, which emphasizes that God has repeatedly avoided the destruction of Israel for the sake of his name. However, Ezekiel 20 anticipates the effect of Israel's destruction on God's name and not of Israel's exile. Ezekiel rather assumes that Israel's exile would not affect God's name, and for this reason, God, who initially wanted to destroy Israel, was satisfied with their exile. Ironically, the prophecy in Ezekiel 20 fulfilled itself. What God has tried to avoid at all costs throughout history happened due to another unexpected factor. The desecration of God's holy name caused him to have mercy on it, and this would set Israel's restoration process in motion. Since Israel's very presence in exile has caused God's name to be desecrated from the outset, this presence must be completely terminated. Therefore, God will gather Israel from among the nations and bring them back to their land. In this case, the exiles' indigenous characteristics, meaning the fact that one could easily point at their geographic origin and their deity they worshipped, serve as a theological factor, initially causing God's holy name to be desecrated, but finally leading to Israel's unavoidable restoration. Now, to what extent can the words of this prophecy be taken seriously? According to Paul Joyce, this is not a genuine identification of the exile's origin and religion, but rather an attribution to the nation of ideas drawn from the prophet's imagination. However, the Yahudu Tablets may indicate that the non-Judean dwellers of the Yahudu area could, and in fact did, identify the exiles in this very way. As mentioned above, the new settlements of the exiles were often named after their place of origin. Thus, the name of the settlement, Al-Yahudu, Judahtown, most clearly testifies to the origin of its inhabitants, and in the earliest tablets it is even called Alusha Yahudaya, the city of the Judeans. In light of this, it is entirely understandable that the non-Judeans who lived near the communities of the Judean exiles could easily perceive that these new settlers had come from his land. The identity of the exiles' god was also known to the surrounding peoples. The theophoric element in their names, Yahu, was preserved and usually written by Babylonian scribes as Yama. In some cases, however, the theophoric element was transcribed almost literally as Yahu, and even marked with the determinative dingir, indicating that the Babylonian scribes knew it refers to a deity. Therefore, beyond knowing their place of origin, there is no doubt that the foreigners living alongside the exiles could also know that these are the people of Yahweh. From this prophecy, we may learn that a significant portion of the exiles, large enough to be called a people, Am, continued to maintain two important indigenous characteristics: their attachment to the homeland in Judah and their devotion to the God of Israel, in a way that was also evident to the surrounding local population. In a forthcoming article, I argue that these native cultural traits were also connected to a concrete expectation of a swift return to the homeland in Judah that were present among the Judean exiles during the first generation after the destruction. Due to time constraints, I will briefly present two examples from the article, one from the book of Ezekiel and the other from the Yahudu Tablets. In the prophetic unit just mentioned, Israel's presence in exile desecrated God's holy name, and this, according to Ezekiel, will cause him to have mercy on it, thus setting Israel's restoration process in motion. Surprisingly, God's mercy on his holy name, Va'echmol, is in the imperfect, which, just like the preceding imperfect verbs in verses 17 to 20, which are highlighted in orange, relate to something that has already happened and is looked back upon. It completely differs from the following verbs, which are highlighted in green, and deliver statements about the future. We may learn that God's mercy on his holy name and everything that must result from it is, according to Ezekiel, something that has already occurred. Israel's restoration process has already begun, and the event that initiated it has already taken place. This indicates that Ezekiel reflects an expectation that Israel's restoration will occur soon, probably in his very generation. I believe that a similar kind of expectation may be found in the Yahudu Tablets. Our knowledge regarding Babylonia's history and economy in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE has significantly improved in the last decades. One of the most fundamental shifts in agriculture is the conversion of arable fields such as barley into date gardens. The main reason for that was date farming was a more efficient form of agriculture than arable farming, and it was more productive in terms of output per surface. The overall productivity of date gardening is further increased by the fact that, unlike barley fields, crops such as cereals and vegetables were grown under the date palms. If we add to the equation the fact that in addition to the dates themselves, it was possible to benefit from other products of the palm, such as leaves and fibers, then the profitability of date farming in comparison to barley only increases. That is, given reasonable climate conditions and political stability, there is a clear economic incentive to switch to date farming. But there is one difference that may have a decisive effect on the farmer's economic decision. A farmer sowing barley can expect a yield several months later. On the other hand, a newly planted date grove would have needed a decade to become reasonably productive. In other words, sowing barley is a small but quick and safe profit, while planting date palms is an investment that may only be worthwhile for those expecting not to leave their place. An investigation of the Yahudu Tablets, which mention Judeans as parties to transactions, reveal that their main occupation in the third generation following the destruction was barley farming. The first time we see an involvement of Judeans in the cultivation of dates is in a tablet dated to the year 551 BCE. The exceptionality of this tablet is evident since the following tablets mentioning Judeans involved in date farming are dated from 529 BCE onwards, and only starting from 518 it is evident that date farming became a central component of the exile's occupation. So, to conclude, the exile was a formative event, and similarly to processes known today from studies conducted on other exile minorities, like the studies of Lisa Malki and others, the responses to it were diverse. Some of the findings from the book of Ezekiel and the Yahudu Tablets suggest pragmatic and flexible approaches regarding individual and communal indigenous identity, aiming to integrate into the local society. Thus, many exiles chose to abandon their native names and adopt names that were more frequent in the local community. Their commitment to Israel's deity decreased, which is reflected in their failure to adhere to norms associated with his worship, and even in worshiping other gods. Ultimately, among these exiles, one can point to a relinquishment of the desire to return to their homeland. In contrast to these approaches, both the book of Ezekiel and the Yahudu Tablets indicate that many exiles tended to separate themselves from other ethnic groups and preserve their indigenous characteristics. They lived in settlements named after their place of origin, and over generations retained their native names. They resided in communities that helped preserve social and economic ties between them. Their cultural, national, and religious traits were visible to the surrounding local society, and ultimately they maintained concrete aspirations to return to their homeland in Judah. Within these internal processes and contradicting ideas, Ezekiel's position is clear and unambiguous. Israel has no future here in exile, and their desire to be like the nations shall never come to pass. Their full restoration can only occur with their return to their homeland. There, and only there, only on my holy mountain, on the lofty mount of Israel, declares the Lord God, there in the land, the entire house of Israel, all of it, must worship me. There I will accept them, and there I will take note of your contribution and the choices of offering. Thank you very much.
We have time for a couple of questions at the most.
That is very interesting. I just want to question whether we should highlight the phenomenon of integration or highlight the phenomenon of indigeneity. Because integration is the sort of the fallback. Integration is the obvious, what's obviously going to happen. Indigeneity is intentional. And perhaps we ought to sort of frame it the same way the thank you is the black against the white, so the contrast. It's the indigeneity that's the intentional and the interesting phenomenon against a wider background of inevitable integration.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that the default is always to assimilate. I'm not sure of that. I think that we see today.
Where are the Ashkelonites who are deported to Babylonia?
You're right. But I think it's important to point the two trends. Okay, you're absolutely right that it's more easy to assimilate. Maybe you just have not to cling on, and the drift will make its own work, right? And it's a choice to maintain your homeland characteristics. But I think it's interesting that both corpuses indicate both trends. Those who like change their names and let go their indigenous characteristics, and those who maintain them, and then you find them in Yehuda thousands of years later. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's worth considering. Just as
Can you speak a bit louder? Yeah.
Sorry, it's worth considering not total assimilation because of name change, but as we had Dr. Trotter mention that Maoris for a while kind of took a different name, or I have students from other countries who sometimes take an English name, or choose a name that's similar to their indigenous name. but they're not planning to assimilate that culture. It's just a way of kind of
You're
fitting in, but they're not actually abandoning their
right.
indigeneity.
First of all, you're absolutely right, and this is only one criteria among others.
Yeah.
But I think that the Assyriologists here will agree that once they forgo their Judean names, it's very difficult for us to identify them.
For sure.
Yeah. So then they just leave the discussion, and so it is one part of a larger scheme. You're right.
This is interesting. Sometimes I've had students take an English name that sounds like their other name.
Yeah.
I know it makes it difficult for the data, it's so limited, but maybe sometimes that could be going on as well.
Yeah, and I told my students, I think yesterday, that it's very evident that when East European immigrants at the first years of the State of Israel, when they came here, and the immigration knew the meaning of their name. So a person named Pearl could easily become Penina in Hebrew. However, immigrants coming from other nations, not East Europe, like Kurdistan or Iraq, and when they came and told someone that their name is Salman, this didn't sound so Hebrew name, and they were Hebraized as Zalman. Okay, so yeah, and these are I met these people, so you're right. Sometimes they retain the original meaning, and sometimes only the sound of the original name. You're right. Yes.
I'm just saying with the Ethiopian jury, it's even more obvious, and now you can see a huge trend of people
returning back. You're absolutely right.
To their original names.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a very, and I think it's a very similar trend to the thing that Sherry talked about.
And just to say, my name is Tova, which is from Gitel.
Okay.
That's exactly what
but
happened.
were you born as Gitel?
No, but never mind.
Okay.
I have them both in my register.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any possibility that indigeneity weaken the hope of return? Today in the morning, I realized that there are many Jewish communities who didn't return from the start.
So the social mechanism is not always clear. I must say that I lived only 1 year in the States, and I met many Jews over there that their ties to the state of Israel are not questionable at all, and they always speak about one day making Aliyah, but this is not an operative plan. Okay, so I don't know if they're going to fulfill this plan ever. So yes, you can maintain your indigenous identity, but remain in your place, and then they can work together. Yes. And as you saw this morning, they work together. Many of them choose not to return. Yeah.
Thank you very much.